Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a video from a channel that I haven't covered in a while called Freedom in God, which they used to abbreviate as FIG to remind you of that time when Jesus didn't know how seasons worked and got mad at a fig tree, but they have since dropped that part of their logo, instead opting for one where the I gets replaced with a cross, making it look more like FTG. Poor guy's just stuck with a bad abbreviation. I kind of feel that. I get confused when people abbreviate Rhino to VR, thinking that they're talking about virtual reality. Anyway, that's more than a little irrelevant, so let's just get to the video!
So is atheism a religion?
No. Atheism is the answer to one single question. Do you believe in a god or gods? If the answer to that question is no, then congratulations, you're an atheist. Now, are there atheist religions? Yes, there are some that exist out there, but the position of atheism is not inherently religious all by itself.
Before we begin, it would be helpful to first define the word religion before we attempt to classify any belief system such as atheism as a religion.
Yes, it would. Excellent! A lot of apologists just skip over the important definitions in their arguments, appealing instead to their audience's intuitive understanding of these terms in order to make their points. Though it is important to recognize that if we are relying on a dictionary definition of a word, dictionaries are not the arbiters of definitions. A good dictionary is one that defines words based on how they are popularly used, so it's reporting on common definitions rather than defining how the word should be used. An excellent example of this is the fact that most dictionaries today will, for one of their definitions, define literally as literally the opposite of literally.
These definitions come from dictionary.com. Number 1 is a set of beliefs concerning the cause, nature and purpose of the universe, especially when considered as the creation of a superhuman agency or agencies, usually involving devotional and ritual observances, and often containing a moral code governing the conduct of human affairs.
A pretty waffly definition to be sure, but not applicable to atheism. Certainly, having atheism as a position can affect your worldview when it comes to the cause, nature, and purpose of the universe, but many atheists just don't give much thought to such things. Superhuman agencies, ritual observances, and moral codes don't apply either, though, again, atheism can have an effect on something like your moral code, but there is no moral code that is inherent to atheism.
Number 2 is a specific fundamental set of beliefs and practices generally agreed upon by a number of persons or sects. Number 3 is the body of persons adhering to a particular set of beliefs and practices.
These two definitions are the ones that I think can get you the closest to the atheism is a religion position, because you could say that the group of people known as atheists would all agree that they do not believe in a god or gods. So if you call this non-belief a belief, then you can kinda make it fit. But now we've run into the problem of having watered down the definition of religion so much as to make almost anything a religion. Do you believe that aliens are visiting the Earth and abducting people? No? Then that's the UFOist religion. So yeah, if you water the word religion down to be essentially meaningless, then atheism can be considered a religion.
Number 4, the practice of religious beliefs, ritual observance of faith.
So obviously not that one. There are no atheist rituals.
And number 5 is something one believes in and follows devotedly, a point or matter of ethics or conscience.
Most atheists that I know don't follow atheism devotedly. They just don't think a god exists. But I could see how this one could be used to call atheism a religion. After all, look at the example. To make a religion of fighting prejudice. So, someone who devotes their life to fighting prejudice. I could see that applying to some people, but this clearly is not a religion in the same sense as Christianity is a religion. This is more akin to just having a passion. You can be passionate about things without those passions being actual, organized religion. So, this is religion in the sense that someone could, say, practice guitar religiously, but nobody would confuse that for being on par with belonging to a church. So again, in order to make this apply, we have to dilute the meaning of the word religion to a point where it's essentially meaningless. So atheism is a homeopathic religion?
So according to these definitions, atheism can indeed be considered a religion.
Only if you stretch the definition so thin as to be functionally useless. But sure. Now just try and count how many religions you belong to based on this stretching of the definition. A UFOist? Probably. A leprechaunist? Yup. A unicornist? Absolutely. A centaurist? You bet.
Say the line, Bart!
If you don't collect stamps, you're part of the non-stamp collecting religion.
Yay!
Every time you come across a claim that you don't accept, you have now joined another religion.
In the Bible, we learn that when God created humankind, He designed an awareness of His existence into human nature.
That's nice, but when discussing whether or not the position of atheism counts as a religion, the Bible is entirely irrelevant. Would you do this for any other religion? Does Hinduism fit the dictionary definition of religion? Well, the Bible says... No, you wouldn't do that, that would be ridiculous. And yet, here we are doing that for atheism for some reason.
This awareness is not full knowledge or understanding of God, it is simply the built-in knowledge that there is an eternal being, God.
Well, no matter what the Bible says on the matter, I can tell you for sure that I do not have this knowledge. And yes, I do think that I am a better authority for what goes on inside my head than the Bible is.
Paul explained it quite clearly in Romans 1 verses 19. He says, "Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it unto them."
Yes, it's the look at the trees verse, followed by the if anyone says they don't believe in God, they're lying verse. Still irrelevant to the topic at hand, but this is one of the most frustrating verses for atheists, and one of the most useless verses for Christians, if they're actually trying to evangelize. Has anyone ever been converted to Christianity because an apologist came along and said, "No, you actually do believe in God, even though you say you don't"? Press X to doubt.
Everyone, believers and unbelievers alike, know there is a God, even though they may deny that knowledge.
So pretend that atheism is a purely hypothetical position, and now answer the question as to whether such a position would constitute a religion. Don't pretend you're making a video on the subject of whether or not atheism is a religion, only to actually make a video about how atheists don't really exist.
History gives us an example. The Athenians had an altar dedicated to a god they knew existed, did not know, and whom they knew they must worship, in Acts 17 verses 23.
Yes, according to the Bible, the Athenians worshipped an unknown deity. I don't think this was a terribly widespread practice, though. I'm having a lot of trouble finding any information on it. It seems as though there is one altar that has been found that is attributed to an unknown god or goddess. That is, one that the people building the altar didn't know, rather than just us not being able to figure out which of the ancient gods it was supposed to be, because there are a few of those ones as well. But it seems that there was a practice in ancient Roman culture of attempting to placate an unknown minor deity that might have an interest in a particular grove before one should go about clearing that grove. So in this case, it's not that they have some innate knowledge of an all-powerful creator, it was concerned that some minor deity that they aren't aware of might cause mischief if steps are not taken to satisfy them. In Acts, Paul talks of there being an altar to the unknown god, and it may be the case that there was an altar dedicated to such a god, but if this practice is anything to go by, the unknown god was not supposed to be the supreme god, as Paul supposed, but just some minor deity whose name isn't even worth learning. I may be wrong on this, of course, details are very sparse, but really, I'm not sure how this would be relevant either way.
The Athenian altar to the unknown god exhibits proof all human beings know there is a god.
No, the Athenian altar to the unknown god exhibits proof that some Athenians worshipped an unknown god. The inscription on the altar reads, "Whether sacred to god or to goddess, Gaius Sextius Calvinus, son of Gaius Praetor, restored this on a vote of the Senate." This barely gives us any information about the god or goddess that this altar was being dedicated to, and it certainly doesn't in any way inform us that all human beings ever to have existed must have believed in a god. In fact, if anything, it tells us that this god or goddess was indeed minor. The inscription is basically saying, yeah, we don't really know if this hunk of rock is actually important to any deities, but we're putting it up just to cover our bases.
God designed human beings to worship Him. When a person does not worship God, he or she will worship anything but God.
If I grant this point that everyone worships something, and atheists just choose to worship something that is not God, Atheism is still not a religion because in order to be a religion, it would have to include some sort of unified belief system, where the atheists can agree on what to worship. But as we are all different individual people with different passions, there really isn't any unified thing that atheists can be said to worship.
That is what atheism is. When a man rejects God, he creates false gods to receive his worship. Mankind creates gods in their own sinful image. For example, the Greek and Roman gods, who were immoral, mendacious, petty, and cruel.
Again, I don't know how that is at all relevant to the conversation. Do you consider the people that were following the ancient Roman religions to be atheists? If yes, then you really need to up your definition game. If no, then why even bring them up in a video about atheism?
In more modern times, there is the Muslim God who commends dying, including by suicide, in a religious cause as the highest form of worship.
And are Muslims atheists to you? Also worth mentioning is that the desire to be martyred for the faith is by no means restricted to the Muslims. In Christian tradition, as early as the 2nd century, we have people like Ignatius who, on some occasions, actually express dismay that they have not been martyred yet, because they see martyrdom as the next step in their relationship with Christ. So, if wanting to die for the faith as a form of worship is evidence of a false religion, then have I got news for you about Christianity.
And the secular humanist God who commends infanticide and euthanasia as the greatest expressions of personal freedom.
Nope, not at all. Firstly, secular humanism is a very specific organization, and while many atheists are secular humanists, there are also some people who identify with other religions that would also consider themselves to be secular humanists. This is possible because secular humanism is not itself a religion, but rather a moral philosophy. As to the euthanasia and infanticide comments, I assume with infanticide you're referring to abortion? Well, in that case, it's a matter of bodily autonomy. Secular humanism does not command anyone to have an abortion. Instead, it would suggest that the people have a right to their own bodies, and should not have pregnancy forced upon them, and consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy. Even the humanists who call themselves pro-abortion start with the premise that it's a matter of choice. Nobody should be forced to have an abortion, just as nobody should be forced to be pregnant. But access to abortion is an important right, and this is a stance that many Christians share. Sure, they're in the minority, but they are out there. Same thing with euthanasia. My life is my own, and if I come to a point in my life where continuing to live is more painful than non-existence would be, then I would like the right to make that decision for myself. And of course, this isn't a black and white issue. Protections need to be in place to ensure that the person making that decision is of sound mind, lest an uncaring child take advantage of a euthanasia policy in order to get their inheritance early or something. And there's a lot more to this matter than that. It gets incredibly complicated incredibly quickly, but there is no proposed policy of imposing euthanasia on people who do not want it.
Man has created gods of the stars, the planets, the sea, the wind, rivers, plants, and animals, has turned his ancestors into God.
Interesting that you mentioned wind there, seeing as how the ancient Hebrew god El took on several of the characteristics of the older Mesopotamian god Enlil. There's a reason the Bible often associates the word spirit with a movement of air. In fact, the Hebrew word translated as spirit is the same word that is often translated as wind. From Strong's Concordance, it is clear that the wind is regarded in Scripture as a fitting emblem of the mighty penetrating power of the invisible God. So follow this line of thinking to its conclusion, and the Christian God basically started life as a wind god.
Has worshipped spirits who supposedly exist in animate and inanimate things.
So, like the Ark of the Covenant? You know, that fancy box that God was supposed to have lived in for a good chunk of the Old Testament?
And has imagined that he can become God himself. Even the atheist creates a God he can worship.
You can always tell that the apologists have their fingers on the pulse of the atheist movement when they refer to people like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins as the gods worshipped by atheists. And if Hitchens is a god, then God is indeed dead. No, many atheists respect these people, though Dawkins in particular seems to have fallen out of majority favor, but none worship them as infallible gods. They have all made points that I agree with, and other points that I disagree with. I worship none of them. And of the more recent prominent atheist figures, I can't think of a single one that I would worship, or with whom I am in constant agreement. And, my dear audience, I doubt you would all agree with me about everything that I say, and if any of you worship me, stop. I don't want it. I can't think of a single atheist who would want it, including the 4 guys he's showing in this video. And I've said something about the other 3, so I should probably say something about Dennett as well, so okay, here it goes. The 4th guy is Dan Dennett. That's all I got. I'm pretty much completely unfamiliar with any of his work, and I'm just assuming that he wouldn't want to be worshipped. Maybe I'm wrong, but I doubt it.
Psalm 14 verses 1 states, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God."
Fancy that. The book that tries to convince you that God exists says that it's only fools who don't believe in God. Tell me, would you find it convincing if I were to find an atheist that has said that all religious believers are stupid? Would that stop you from believing? Because it wouldn't take much effort at all. No, that wouldn't convince you. Or if it would, it should not. And I myself actually advocate against using such language, as there are many very highly intelligent people who are deeply religious. I'd go so far as to say that such language is unhelpful no matter which side it's on.
The fool doesn't deny the existence of God. He rejects the authority of the one true God, replacing God with himself. In other words, he becomes his own God.
Yeah, sure, buddy. We all worship ourselves.
J.J. Stewart Perone writes of Psalm 14 verses 1. He says, "There is here rather a practical than a theoretical atheism, not so much a denial of the being of a God as a denial of his moral government of the world."
I think at this point we should probably read the whole verse, because this is one of those Bible verses that conveniently gets half the verse dropped when people quote it, because the second half of the verse makes it very obviously wrong. So, Psalm 14:1. "The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, they do abominable deeds, there is none who does good." The second half of that verse is demonstrably untrue, and so it gets left out of the quotation. All you need to do to prove this verse wrong is to find one single atheist who does any sort of charitable work, and that's an easy thing to do. I know several off the top of my head, but I also know that they wouldn't want to make a big fuss about it, so I'll settle for pointing out that enough of my own income goes to charity every year that I get warnings from my tax software that my unusually high amounts of charitable donations might trigger an audit. Now, keep in mind, I live in a nation where the majority of people are Christian. They're supposed to be tithing, donating 10% of their income to charity. If they all did that, then my donations would not be suspiciously high. It would be normal. So from this data, I can infer that I am more generous with my money than your average Christian. And yet, someone who says in their heart that there is no God is a fool who is corrupt, does abominable deeds, and does no good. And also, as long as we're talking about the Psalms with reference to God being the moral governor of the world, let's just quickly pop over to Psalm 137:9 and sing about how happy he is who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rocks.
Every human being knows, because of the way God has designed human nature, that there is a God who must be worshipped, a God who requires submission and dependence.
Nope, I do not know that. And while I don't consider myself an authority for much, I don't think there's a better authority than me when it comes to what I do and do not know. So, according to the world's leading expert in what goes on inside Vice Rhino's head, the knowledge of God just isn't there.
But the atheist refuses to submit to God and therefore rejects God. He hides his rebellion with the lie to himself and others that there is no God.
And when an atheist such as myself hears rhetoric like this, it conjures images of an apologist trying desperately to reassure their customers that, yes, my product really does work. Anyone who says otherwise is lying. And one of the primary rules for sales jobs is to not talk smack about the competitor's products. People will trust you more about the product where you're financially motivated to make it look good if you're willing to also say good things about a product that you are not financially motivated to promote. When a salesperson starts talking about how bad their competition is, it immediately raises the customer's suspicions that they are just trying to make the sale and aren't worried too much about the truth. And that's exactly what this line of argumentation sounds like to an atheist. A bad salesman trying to convince you that the competition is garbage.
Atheism is not disbelief in God, but actually the rejection of God.
That's actually kinda true. Not so much the rejection of God, but rather the rejection of the God claim. You say, there is a God. I say, I don't believe you. Please provide evidence. And that's atheism.
Is atheism actually a religion?
No. It is the answer to one question. Do you believe in God? As you yourself just pretty much explained.
The answer is yes.
There's 1 minute left in his video. Do you think he's actually going to tie any of this together in that time? So far, he's read in the dictionary a bunch of definitions for religion that don't apply to atheism unless you completely dilute what the word religion even means, so that everyone belongs to millions of religions, one for every mythical creature or unsubstantiated concept that they just don't accept by default, followed by the assertion that atheism doesn't really exist anyway. So if atheism doesn't exist because everybody really does believe in God, how can that be a religion?
The atheist worships. He cannot help it because God designed the necessity to worship into human nature. The atheist, like all who reject the one true God, creates an idol. In his case, it is an idol of himself to satisfy both the inner knowledge that there is a God and the inner necessity to worship that God.
Oh yeah, of course, the atheism is the religion of worshipping oneself thing. Well, I don't, but if I did, at least I can provide evidence for my own existence. So even if you're right and atheism is the religion of self-worship, then atheism wins the evidentiary battle, because I don't need to resort to logical argumentation to get you to believe that I exist. I can just interact with you and that'll pretty much do it.
The atheist creates a religion of trust in himself that meets one or more of the above definitions of religion. But this is foolish, and is the very deception that began in the Garden of Eden with the lie that we can be as God.
So I'll just take this opportunity to plug a new podcast that I'm working on, in which I read Bible stories to my daughter and get her initial impressions. I just read Genesis 1 through 3 to her yesterday, and she immediately picked up on the fact that God created evil and is therefore behaving evilly, and she figured out that the serpent was the only character in the story to tell the truth. Because he was. He told Eve that if she ate of the tree, her eyes would be opened, and she would be like God, and that she now knows good and evil. God himself stated later on in the story that this is exactly what happened. So the serpent did not deceive Eve, he told her exactly what would happen. God, on the other hand, said that you would surely die in the day you ate the fruit. And they then went on to live another 900 years or so, being some of the longest living humans in history, if the story is to be believed. I'm not sure if I'll have a link for the podcast by the time this video goes up, so check the video description for that, and keep an eye out for future announcements.
If we don't put God at his rightful place of worship, we will put something else there. And that is when we start worshipping created things rather than the creator of all things.
Well, the created things have the advantage of evidently existing, while the creator of all things evidently does not. So if I must worship something, I'd prefer that something to actually be real. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Mike Kowalski, who says, "It's girlfriend in Canada. For me in Buffalo, sometimes that could be said as Niagara Falls, but I've always known the idea as in Canada. John, you have a girlfriend? Yeah, and she's super hot, but you don't know her. She lives in Canada." This was a response to my having said that I find that line about having a girlfriend that you wouldn't know because she's from Niagara Falls to be weird. And we're actually both kind of right. I was specifically thinking of the line from The Breakfast Club, in which he invokes Canada and Niagara Falls in the same line.
She lives in Canada. Met her at Niagara Falls.
Also, I can see Buffalo from my front yard, and not in a Sarah Palin seeing Russia kind of way. So, hi neighbor! Thanks for watching, thanks to this week's PayPal hero, Charles, and special thanks as always to my patrons, Mark McManus, Mark Hetcham, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the gods of my atheist religion. If you'd like me to worship you, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, which are linked in the description. If you'd like to listen to my videos in podcast form, the link for that is also in the description, as well as links to my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!